Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today's program is another archival video from the year 2004 with one of my mentors and heroes, Professor Charles Tart. This is a video that was made as part of a documentary that was never released. And in this video, Dr. Tart, who is an emeritus professor from the University of California at Davis and was one of my own dissertation faculty members when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, he is the author of a number of books and anthologies: Waking Up, States of Consciousness, Altered States of Consciousness, Scientific Studies in the Psychic Realm, and many, many more. And in this interview, he covers many topics. If you haven't seen Dr. Tart before on the New Thinking Aloud channel, you might wish to check our listings because we have another dozen interviews with him on this channel and some additionally on the original Thinking Aloud channel. But now I'll switch over to the archival video.
I don't like to describe the subject matter of parapsychology or transpersonal psychology as anomalies because while technically anomalies just mean something that doesn't fit into what you already know, the way it's actually used, it tends to have a sort of put-down quality. That anomalies are little flukes that we'll explain away someday, and that automatically makes them seem unimportant. And I think the phenomena of parapsychology are vitally important, not little anomalies that are going to be explained away someday. Now, the fact that I don't like the word anomalies is not a view shared by all my colleagues, and I can understand why some of them use it. Parapsychologists would like to be accepted more into mainstream science because that would give us the kind of resources we know we need to do more adequate research. And so in approaching scientists who tend to be biased against this subject matter, using a term like anomalies may be less arousing of their defenses than using a term like telepathy. And the language can be important. I remember years ago we used to joke when the Soviet Union was doing a lot of psychic research that they did not investigate telepathy. Telepathy was a decadent capitalist concept that was used to enslave the masses. They studied bioinformation transfer, which was a proper Marxist concept. Same thing. So I don't like the connotations of the language, but I can understand sometimes using anomalies may be the appropriate tactic to get people's attention without getting their defenses too activated.
Okay.
Again, what they call it matters so much in terms of some people's psychological defenses. Transpersonal psychology takes a relatively different approach to the subject matter than parapsychology. Parapsychology, as it's practiced today, is largely aimed at getting people trapped in a materialistic worldview to realize there is evidence for unusual phenomena that we call telepathy or clairvoyance or healing or something like that. It's important to look at that. Transpersonal psychology tends to take spiritual reality for granted. People just have spiritual experiences. Let's not argue about their reality, but get on with the questions of how can we help people have them? How can we help people integrate them into their everyday life afterwards? How can we distinguish, say, pathological variations from healthy variations? The two fields can contribute to each other, but I don't think anyone in transpersonal psychology uses the term anomalies. Transpersonal psychology is a very interesting word. I think the term was coined by Carl Jung a long time ago, but nobody used it for anything, so it stayed in the shadows. And it's basically about the psychology of experiences that take you beyond trans, T-R-A-N-S, beyond your ordinary physical, social, biological self. It's a term that has come into some usage now because it's less threatening. Again, we get into the psychology of things here. To give you an example, back in 1975, I had a book in press with Harper and Row that was called Spiritual Psychologies. And just before it went to the printers, I got a phone call from the editor who said, good news and bad news. The good news is that the main psychology book club in the United States wants to adopt it as their selection when it comes out. And I thought, oh, wow. He said, the bad news is that psychologists can't handle the word spiritual. That's strictly taboo for them. Can we rename it something else? So a few people had started to talk about transpersonal psychology then, so we renamed the book that so we wouldn't trigger this automatic defensive reaction on people's part. Stan's a transpersonal psychologist as well as a parapsychologist. I think of myself primarily as a transpersonal psychologist, actually, in that while I'm really interested in the technical side of parapsychology, it's the larger picture of our human nature, of the spiritual aspects of our human nature. That's what's investigated in transpersonal psychology, and that's my main interest. The questions about the nature of the human mind and what life is really about and so forth have occupied me since I was a child. And when I was a child, I basically accepted what they taught me in church. I mean, I was a child. I didn't question any of that. And as I got older, I began to question what the church taught, and why so many adults were hypocritical and didn't practice the religion they preached and all that. And coming into knowing about science and seeing how that seemed to conflict with a lot of spirituality. But I remained interested in the questions. And so in thinking about my career, I've seen two major dynamic forces that have constantly influenced my career, which are, on the one hand, I'm very curious and open-minded. I'm willing to look at unusual things and new things and things that don't fit. But on the other hand, I don't like to be fooled. Ever since I was a child, I don't like it when I get suckered into something that turns out to be incorrect. So it's a constant balance with me between, yes, I'll listen to people's spiritual experiences or psychic experiences, but on the other hand, there are imitations of these things and pathological versions. I don't want to be misled by them, so when I get in my more technical side, I get very precise and exact. I want to do an experiment that's just right, that's methodologically sophisticated. I don't want to be fooled, but I don't want to get so involved in the technicalities that I forget that psychic experiences are not some funny little thing that just happens in the laboratory, but things that happen to real people that tell us something about the nature of the human mind and the human soul. I would like to say that questions about the existence of various parapsychological effects like telepathy are a simple matter of rationally evaluating the evidence. The evidence is very good, therefore we conclude as our best understanding of the world that people can be telepathic or clairvoyant sometimes and the like. But of course I'd be denying reality if I said something like that. There are strong non-rational factors affecting whether people accept or don't accept parapsychological phenomena. The general public tends to accept parapsychological phenomena in a wholesale and a kind of non-discriminating sort of way. And I don't know whether that's good or bad, because on the one hand, they're open to hearing about this research, but on the other hand, they take really very poor quality ideas and things that are probably illusory and act as if that's probably parapsychological too. Now, when you get to the intellectual community, especially the scientific community or the psychological community, there's much less acceptance in general of parapsychological phenomena. Part of that acceptance is sort of rational. Most fields of science have done extremely well developing themselves with a totally materialistic model of human consciousness. It's all brain function. And we like to stay with things that succeed. And when something comes up that seems to contradict that model, how can people show telepathy? The brainwaves are too weak to travel any distance, or there's a certain reluctance to take a look at the evidence because it doesn't fit. That is, we tend to get arrogant about what we know and automatically dismiss certain things as impossible. But scientists are dedicated to going beyond this. Scientists are supposedly dedicated to putting data before theory, to putting looking at what actually happens before any ideas they have about the way the world works. And yet very few scientists will do that. I've almost never met a critic of parapsychology, for instance, that I respect. And I tend to call them pseudo-critics because they're not really genuinely skeptical or genuinely critical. They have an a priori belief that this stuff is nonsense. Therefore, they've never bothered to look at the evidence. Therefore, they've never seen any evidence to contradict their beliefs. And it's a nice closed belief system, but that's not science. That's not what it's about. Psychologists, I think, tend to be especially resistant to the findings of parapsychology because of a fear of status. Now, it's only been 100 years since they let us out of the philosophy department. And how much status do philosophers have compared with scientists in the ordinary social world? Not much. Whether that's deserved or not, but that's just the sort of academic snob system. Psychologists want to be thought of as scientists. And if the other sciences are all based on a total materialism, psychology has largely adopted that, and they want to justify themselves in terms of other scientists, so psychologists tend to be especially resistant to looking at any of the data of parapsychology. And again, it's quite irrational because it's not as if they actually look at the data and evaluate it and find some flaws. They don't look at it because of a previous belief that this sort of thing is impossible. I think there are deeper emotional roots of resistance also that we've barely begun to look at in any way. So, for instance, if I say to you, I can read the deep thoughts in your mind, how do you feel about that? That's, I don't know, it's sort of like we all want to be known on our terms. We present a certain social front and the like. We're careful about how we reveal ourselves. There's something very threatening at some very primal level about the thought of some unknown way of gathering information that goes past all your normal defenses. I think those deeper levels of resistance manifest in the irrational resistance to parapsychology. I'll give you a particular example among parapsychologists. Now, you would think parapsychologists would be the most open to accepting this. But I've seen very peculiar behavior over the 40 years or more that I've been in the field. I've seen people occasionally present papers at the Parapsychological Association meetings where they get a lot of psychic manifestation in a given experiment, and the amount of criticism from their colleagues is enormous. Whereas somebody else presents one and it's sort of statistically significant but kind of trivial. Somebody was guessing red or black on cards and they averaged 51% instead of 50%, and they did it for a long time, so it's significant. And if that's methodologically okay, that doesn't get much criticism. And I've characterized this as what I call the religion of the 0.05 level, the 5% level of significance. If by some abstract statistics somebody tells you there's psychic abilities here, but not strong enough to make you have to deal with your resistances, people accept it. But when it comes very strongly, there's tremendous fighting against that kind of thing. Now, it's very strange. If I were a laser physicist and I went to a professional meeting and said, I've gotten my laser to work 4 times as good as they usually do, everybody would want to know, how do you do it? Show me. They'd want to be able to do it too. Instead, we get this very funny resistance. So even my colleagues and I, we're a little bit screwy. There are deep levels of resistance to psychic phenomena, which varies a lot from person to person, of course. And we haven't begun to deal with those things yet. And of course, they don't fit our image. Also, we want to be objective scientists like everybody else. I'm a pure scientist interested only in the search for truth. I have no emotional biases of any sort. Ha! As far as I'm concerned, the way to deal with your biases is to admit that you have them, and then if you also would like to know the truth about something, you can begin to compensate for those biases. But to pretend to objectivity when it's probably not there just gets you into a lot of trouble. One of the things I really like personally about science, and that I think it's its great strength, is its emphasis on data, on observation, on going out into the world and seeing what actually happens. And if your theories don't agree with your data, that's too bad for your theories. Now, the reason I like that is because I'm a thoughtaholic. I really get off on good thoughts. If something's clever, if something's elegant, I get very involved. And my scientific training reminds me of, but how do things actually happen in the actual world? Whether they fit in with these good ideas or not. So many of the phenomena I'm interested in transpersonal psychology, the spiritual kind of stuff, for instance, it's very hard to get data unless you go inside. Okay? If you want to study somebody who's studied yoga for 20 years and your objective study shows that she sits still a lot, that's probably not the essence of yoga. So all through my career, I've tried to balance taking time to learn to go inside more deeply, getting some first-hand experience with some of these phenomena versus the more objective study of them. Not that I'm ever going to become some great mystic or great psychic or something like that, but I'd like to know what these things feel like at least a little bit from the inside. And then when I study them in other people more as a scientist from the outside, I'm more likely to do stuff that's actually relevant to what goes on instead of getting carried away with some irrelevant sort of ideas. So all through my career, I've tended to go back and forth between, spending some time meditating each day, which I was very lousy at most of my life, but I'm finally beginning to get a handle on, and doing more experimental kind of work, more scholarly kind of work. Well, in terms of my own career, I'll give you the brief overview. I became interested in parapsychology and spirituality at the time I was a teenager. It was part of my own personal struggle with the conflict between science and religion. And with the wisdom of hindsight, I notice most people go through some kind of struggle between science and religion. And they tend to take either of two extreme positions. One is to kind of take what they think is a scientific position and say all religion is nonsense, forget it. Or at the other hand, rigidly believe certain religious things and try to not notice how science seems to conflict with them. And both of them are sort of partial knowledge kind of approaches. I was lucky in coming across the literature of psychical research in parapsychology and realizing that other people had gone through this struggle and had come up with this brilliant idea of let's apply the methods of science, the emphasis on observation, to spirituality and religion and psychic phenomena and start weeding out the sense from the nonsense. And that's been my mission ever since then. Now, I became active in this when I was a freshman at MIT. I thought I was going to be an electrical engineer, but I was still very interested in parapsychology, so I started a psychical research club. And we found many students interested. Underneath the crew cuts of these engineering students, there were people with very interesting interests. And after a couple of years at MIT, I decided I really wanted to be a psychologist. And I had met J.B. Rhine by that time. So he helped me transfer to Duke because there was no psychology at MIT. I couldn't do anything there. And I visited Rhine's lab occasionally, but he and I disagreed on some things, so he put me on the list of people to be discouraged from visiting, which I got mad at the time, but I now regard as an honor because a lot of very creative people got put on that list. He was trying to preserve standards, and I understand where he was coming from. And then I went on transferred to the University of North Carolina, so I never actually officially worked at the Duke Laboratory. I finished my PhD work there, went to California for a couple of years on a postdoctoral fellowship, studying hypnosis research with Ernest Hilgard. Then a year at the University of Virginia with Ian Stevenson, although I didn't work directly on any of the reincarnation stuff, and then ended up at the University of California at Davis for the next 28 years. I was always interested in consciousness, but at the young age at which I was interested, there wasn't much written about consciousness. It was totally unfashionable in psychology. And in terms of unusual states of consciousness, about the only stuff you could find was stuff on dreams and on hypnosis. So I became interested in dreams and hypnosis and investigated both of them once I got into graduate school in the early part of my professional career. But as I got more and more specialized knowledge in hypnosis and dreams, I also began to realize that, there's a larger context here, right? And if I just keep drilling down into these two phenomena, I'm liable to miss certain important points. So I got interested in all sorts of altered states of consciousness, psychedelic drug-induced states, meditation-induced states, and so forth. And that's actually was a turning point in my career. And in 1969, I published my anthology on altered states of consciousness, where I tried to alert people in general to, hey, there's a lot of interesting modes that the human mind can operate in, and we need a picture of the whole thing to really understand it. And I think that was probably one of the most significant things I ever did, to publish that book, because the material I found was scientific material, but it was few and far between and scattered in very esoteric places, so it had no impact on science in general because people didn't see it. So by putting it together that way, people could see the whole spectrum of consciousness. A lot of courses got started using it as a textbook, and the whole topic of altered states became, I don't want to say central. It didn't get that much attention, but it got into psychology at that time. I'm at a stage in my career where I'm semi-retired, so I'm not actively doing any experiments anymore, but I'm trying to make sense of the things I've learned over the years. And I'm hoping that with age comes a little bit of wisdom, so I have a wider context to put these things in. In particular, the thing that's focusing me now is the question of spiritual growth. What in the world is spiritual growth? Or people talk about enlightenment. What's enlightenment? What do we mean by that? You know, these words are very vague. So I'm in the process now of slowly putting together a book to talk about what I think are different dimensions of enlightenment or spiritual growth. One of those, for instance, involves having altered states of consciousness available. Because the way I look at it, any altered state of consciousness is a tool. And like any tool, it's very useful for some things and not too useful for others. So I tend to carry this Leatherman tool with me, okay? It's very good if you need a pair of pliers. It's not a very good hammer. Doesn't have you can hammer with it, but you can't do a very good job of it. I think most altered states are like that. They're good for some things, they're poor for others. So one dimension of spiritual growth is to have some altered states available and know what state is appropriate for the task that's facing you right now. Get into that state and work from there, rather than doing it from some state that isn't a very good tool for it. It's a funny world, because you have the general public accepting all sorts of ideas about psychic stuff too uncritically, and so believing a certain amount of nonsense as well as some truth mixed in there. You've got an irrationally skeptical scientific community that won't accept anything about it. And then you've got parapsychologists, most of whom accept some basic psychic phenomena, like telepathy and clairvoyance or precognition, stuff that we have evidence for. And then you move on to a very interesting problem that was really at the core of parapsychology when it began as psychical research, but is largely ignored now, the question of, can we survive death? And the most direct evidence bearing on that question of do we survive death in some form are mediumistic communications. If the medium claims to contact Uncle Joe, can Uncle Joe then give specific details about his life that convince you that this is indeed Uncle Joe? And a lot of mediumistic seances are really terribly general. They don't really prove anything, but sometimes the apparent Uncle Joe gets pretty specific and pretty correct. And now here's where this very strange concept of super psi comes in. Some parapsychologists have said, well, I'll accept the fact that you living human beings can read minds and pick up information about the material world through clairvoyance and all that, but the idea of surviving death, that's too weird. So I'm going to take these good mediumistic seances and explain them away by saying, actually, the medium is super psi to pick up relevant information about this deceased person and work that into an imitation of the deceased person, and that's more comfortable than accepting survival. I find the whole thing kind of amusing, actually, because if you're going to attribute that much psychic ability to human beings, that sounds like the kind of being that might survive death. Okay, yes. I mean, you know, if you want to embark on the spiritual path in modern times, It's not like it always was in traditional times, where if you went to be on a spiritual path, you didn't have choices to make.
Yes.
You were lucky if there was one temple or ashram or something like that where you could learn a particular technique and you did that thing. And now we're exposed to so many different things. So I think it's perfectly appropriate for people, in a sense, to start out by trying some of this, some of that, some of that. But I do think there comes a point where you have to find what you would call a path with heart, to quote Castaneda.
That's so funny
you
you
know?
bring that up. Yes, of
Something that really feels, this is where I want to focus. Not to turn your back on the other things, okay? I don't think that's smart in the modern world, but something where you really want to focus. And so, you would need to figure out where do you really want to go, and find an appropriate setting or teacher or something like that to do that. I mean, I train, as it were, with 2 or 3 meditation teachers, and what they do suits where I want to be at this time in my life. Whether they'd be any good for anybody else, I don't know. I mean, it must be good for some people, but not for many, or not for just anyone. And, I could go into an hour-long lecture on the problems with meditation, what a vague word it is, nobody uses it consistently, blah, 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 blah.
Well,
but the more important thing is what you want to do and then finding a way to get there.
Yes.
I did transcendental meditation for 1.5 years. It didn't produce what I expected it or wanted it to, but what it did produce was very interesting.
yes.
In retrospect, we might learn a lot from our mistakes, but at some point we do want to figure out an efficient path for us. And one of my dreams to inspire some young psychologists to do is to take the next 100,000 people who start out on various spiritual paths and test them with every psychological test we can throw at them. Because we don't know what's going to be useful here, but let's get lots and lots of data and then assess these people 5 years down the path, 10 years down the path, 15 years down the path. And someday somebody will come into my office, well, theoretically, I'll be dead by this time, but will come into some psychologist's office and say, I want to become more spiritual or something like that. What should I do? And instead of either, that's crazy, or, well, I go with this teacher, do what I did, they'll be able to say, take these psychological tests, and then they'll be scored, and then they'll be able to say something like, okay, we don't recommend your type study Zen because there's a 40% psychosis rate for your type with Zen and only a 5% enlightenment rate. But Sufi dancing, on the other hand, hardly any psychosis rate on that, lots and lots of satisfaction or whatnot. We'll be able to selectively direct people to spiritual paths that are liable to work for them. And I think we can develop this in a purely empirical way by finding out what actually works. This is a dream project. I don't know if anybody's ever going to do it. But it'll be a big improvement over what we got now of try this, that, and the other thing, and who knows how much time you waste, whether you get into trouble for going in the wrong direction, or whether you're lucky early in the game to find something that's really a path with heart for you. Even spiritual teachers who say, their tradition individualizes the path for people, I don't see a great deal of individualization. It's like, I'm teaching you this way because my teacher taught me that way, because her teacher taught her that way, etc. And one size doesn't fit all. And also, I think teaching spirituality is very inefficient. A friend of mine, Shinzen Young, who I think is one of the top meditation teachers around, he turned me into a meditator, which I regard as practically miraculous. He and I were once talking about how well does meditation work for people. And he said it had been his observation that if he teaches a course on meditation or a retreat or something like that, practically everybody gets a feeling for meditation and it feels right and they're going to do it. If he comes back a year later and 5% of them are still meditating, he's doing well. And I was shocked. And he says, that's how it is with other teachers too, even the Eastern teachers. That's awful. If I started a university and I had a 95% flunk out rate the first year, I would think we don't know how to teach yet. They don't worry about it in the East. If it's your karma to come around, you'll come around. If it's your karma to fall away, you'll fall away. Maybe you'll come back 10 lifetimes down the road. I'm sorry, I'm a Westerner. I want something more efficient. That's why I think that science, especially psychology and the spiritual traditions, can cooperate and start steering people toward techniques that are more effective for particular people.
Yeah.
The path with heart is the bottom line,
Yes.
I mean, I can get interested in all these esoteric things and these strange states and unusual phenomena, but when somebody tells me about their spiritual path, the question I ask is, in the long run, have they developed more wisdom and compassion? If they have, it's a great spiritual path for them. If all they've done is had funny experiences and feel special, well, there's lots of ways of feeling special.
Sure.
I don't put down data because it's, quote, subjective.
Yes.
Experience is experience is experience,
Yes.
like William James. I'm a radical empiricist. That's what people experience is just as good as what they see on the outside.